A man was shot in front of a crowd, not on a battlefield, not in a war zone. At a university event, Charlie Kirk's death ripped open a question we keep avoiding. When speech collides with blood, how much freedom can we still afford? We dig into the collision of free speech and safety on campuses, in protests, and at public events. This isn't an abstract debate. After tragedies like Kirk's assassination, every decision, who speaks, who protests, who attends, suddenly carries the weight of life and death. We'll ask the hardest questions. Should speech have limits? When lives are at risk? Should platforms and universities be held responsible for hosting dangerous ideas? Or is restricting speech the greater danger? If you've ever wondered how fragile freedom really is, this will force you to look it in the eye. Freedom of speech is often treated as sacred, but in practice, it's anything but safe. When a controversial figure is scheduled to speak on campus, the atmosphere changes instantly. Administrators receive threats. Security plans double in size. Students prepare counter-demonstrations. And police begin calculating how quickly tensions could escalate. At Utah Valley University, those precautions weren't enough. No one expected the event to end in tragedy before a live audience. That moment shattered the illusion that public expression can ever be completely separate from real-world danger. The incident forced the nation to see what universities already know. Hosting speech is not a neutral act. It's a gamble with real stakes. Every microphone handed to a polarizing figure carries with it the potential for unrest. And yet, refusing that microphone opens institutions to lawsuits, political backlash, and accusations of silencing debate. The fragile line between expression and safety has become the center of our national anxiety. The phrase, free speech, is misleading. There is nothing free about it. Each controversial event carries an invisible cost: extra security, barricades to manage crowds, surveillance setups, evacuation plans, and insurance coverage in case of legal challenges. The more intense the speaker's reputation, the higher the cost. Some universities have spent hundreds of thousands of dollars just to keep a single event under control. For wealthy institutions, that expense can be absorbed. For smaller schools, it's often impossible. Canceling becomes the only option. Critics call this the heckler's veto, the idea that loud threats of disruption can shut down speech. They argue that if institutions give in to this pressure, the most aggressive voices end up deciding who speaks. But from the inside, administrators see a different calculation. Spend money the campus doesn't have, or risk situations no one wants to see repeated. There is no perfect answer, only competing dangers. And after the tragedy at Utah Valley, the pressure to choose safety over principle will only intensify. Public universities are bound by the Constitution. They cannot ban a speaker simply for being offensive or provocative. Their limits are narrow. They can restrict speech only if it directly incites imminent violence or contains genuine threats. Everything else, no matter how inflammatory, is protected under the law. But private platforms like X, YouTube, TikTok, and Facebook operate under a completely different system. They're not governed by the First Amendment. They set their own rules, and that gives them extraordinary power. These companies can remove videos, suspend accounts, or limit reach, without any legal obligation to explain why. After major political flashpoints, like the events of January 6th, entire networks of accounts were taken down in a single sweep. To some, that move was a necessary step to prevent further unrest. To others, it felt like a modern form of censorship. Now, with recent tragedies tied to public appearances and online mobilization, a harder question is resurfacing. If a platform amplifies voices whose rhetoric later sparks real-world harm, should they be held responsible? Or would holding them accountable threaten the very principle of open dialogue? Universities face the same dilemma in physical space, and platforms face it in the digital one. Both are struggling with the same question. Where does responsibility end and freedom begin? The right to protest is celebrated as a cornerstone of democracy. It's how citizens make themselves heard. But on college campuses, protests around controversial speakers often create a paradox. Students and activists assert their right to dissent. Yet when demonstrations turn heated, they sometimes end up silencing the very event they oppose. University leaders face an impossible balance, protecting the speaker's right to be heard, while also defending the protester's right to resist. Every decision has consequences. If police step in too aggressively, students accuse administrators of suppressing activism. If they hold back, tensions can quickly spiral, and public safety becomes uncertain. This tension has changed the atmosphere on many campuses. Some institutions now deploy visible security teams during high-profile events. Bag checks, metal detectors, and restricted entry points have become the norm, making public spaces feel less like forums for discussion and more like controlled zones. Students describe the experience as intimidating rather than empowering. On other campuses, limited security has led to disruptions, canceled talks, and physical altercations. There's no perfect playbook, only judgment calls made in real time. And as recent tragedies have shown, one misstep can turn a moment of expression into a national flashpoint. Here lies the darkest question. When a life is lost, should society change the rules of speech? Some argue yes. They say tragedy exposes the danger of unchecked rhetoric, and that institutions have a duty to act, cancel events, restrict incendiary voices, tighten policies. For them, blood becomes the ultimate warning sign that even freedom has limits. But others resist. They argue that letting violence dictate speech creates a blueprint for silencing. If every act of harm narrows the boundaries of expression, then the most ruthless win by fear. For these critics, tragedy must never be the trigger for censorship. Kirk's passing didn't create these tensions. It revealed them. And now, every campus, every protest, every platform must decide, when violence erupts, what changes and what must remain untouched. Here lies the darkest question. When a life is lost, should society change the rules of speech? Some say yes, that tragedy uncovers the danger of unchecked words, and that those in power have a duty to act. For them, blood is the ultimate warning that liberty has limits, but others push back. They warn that if violence defines what can be said, freedom will fade, one restriction at a time. For them, tragedy cannot be the trigger for silence. Kirk's passing didn't invent this conflict, it exposed it. And now, every campus, every protest, every platform faces the same question. When lives are on the line, what do we change and what must stay untouched? Here's the paradox, stripped bare. If we allow safety to override speech, freedom shrinks. If we allow speech to override safety, lives are put at risk. There is no permanent balance, only shifting boundaries, drawn in moments of crisis. This isn't a theory, it's real, it's unfolding. In every campus debate, every protest, every boardroom and moderation meeting, and after recent tragedies, the weight of these choices has never been heavier. So I'll leave you with this. When freedom and safety collide, which would you sacrifice first?